Welcome to Nonprofit Expert, presented by Donor Perfect.
Welcome to Nonprofit Expert, presented by Donor Perfect. We're so glad to have you here. My name is Julia. I work with Donor Perfect on the marketing team, and I'm so glad to be joined by Mallory Erickson today. Mallory, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role in the nonprofit world?
Yeah, so I have spent my entire career in the nonprofit sector, although it was not necessarily what I expected. But I started right out of college working for an organization in Boston. I was really focused on education policy and working in the public schools there. And like so many people inside the sector, ended up becoming an accidental fundraiser as I stayed in the sector and started to move my way up. And first in a managing director role and then executive director role, had big fundraising responsibilities. And I hated fundraising.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I think a lot of people end up in that place. I also was in fundraising, and I got a job right out of college that was at a nonprofit. And then, as you mentioned, kind of moved through the ranks and became a development director. And suddenly it was part of my role to fundraise. And nobody told me anything about that. And they just said, okay, this is our budget and try and find it. That's a little intense.
Yeah. When I was graduating college, there weren't nonprofit courses, and I didn't really understand all the systems involved in creating social services through nonprofits. And so I didn't understand that element of it or expect that element of it. But I loved the organization. I wanted to further the work, and raising money to do so was a core piece of that. And so I kind of powered through, but always felt really uncomfortable and ill-prepared, and like I didn't know something that was hidden under a rug that everybody else seemed to understand but me. And I remember always saying, like, you know, there's no way that good fundraisers want to throw up before major donor meetings. And so I had this big narrative in my head that I was a bad fundraiser, but that's what it sort of looked like to, move up in this sector. And so I really got to a moment where I was thinking about leaving the sector because I couldn't figure out how to get fundraising to work for me. And I ended up having some really lucky combination of life experiences that weren't initially connected to my fundraising. I got certified as an executive coach. I got trained in habit and behavior design with Dr. BJ Fogg, and I got trained in design thinking. And those frameworks, while I was frontline fundraising, really fundamentally shifted the way that I fundraised. And it had huge financial implications. I ended up moving an organization from $1 million to 3.8 really quickly.
Wow.
But more than anything, I started to love fundraising. And I was like, if I can love fundraising, anyone can love fundraising.
Yes, well, I think we all need to learn these things that you've learned. That's really wonderful to be able to step into a role that maybe you didn't know a ton about, and then be able to say, I really love it here and I'm thriving. You mentioned about this behavioral habit science, and it's something that sometimes we have blockers in our head that we don't really know about. I know I felt that way when I was fundraising. I didn't know what was stopping me from making the ask, or what was stopping me from trying something new for a campaign or something like that. Will you explain a little bit about what you've learned with the behavioral connection to fundraising?
Yeah. So one of the core principles of executive coaching is this idea of the cognitive behavior loop. So it's this concept that our thoughts and our beliefs inform how we feel, and then how we feel ultimately impacts how we show up. So the actions that we take, but also the energy with which we take those actions. And then that's what ultimately impacts our results. And so I think before I really understood the connection between my thoughts and my beliefs and my feelings and my actions, I was hyper focused on my actions and, the to-do lists and the prioritizing to-do lists. And I never really looked at what some of the driving forces were behind why I was taking certain actions, why I wasn't taking certain actions, right? When we're focused like action only, then we can have this running to-do list. We never have enough time to do everything on our to-do list. Nobody does. That day is never coming, right? And so, but then we just keep saying, oh, okay, well, I just deprioritized it, but I'll prioritize it tomorrow. And it's when we start to understand that actually there's resistance there. There's something happening inside our brain and inside our body that is keeping that 5-minute task on your to-do list day after day after day. And we start to be able to get curious about that and say, okay, how does that action make me feel? Oh, it makes me feel uncomfortable. I feel like a sinking in my belly. I feel anxious when I think about it. Okay, so what are some of the thoughts and the beliefs that are leading to that anxiety? Because fundraising is just fundraising. Like, it's what makes things stressful are the thoughts and the beliefs that we hold about fundraising. I'm never going to hit this year's budget. I have no idea how I did that last year, so I don't know how I'm going to do it this year. So-and-so donor is giving less, and so that means X. Blank is mad at me because they haven't responded to my email in 48 hours. Those narratives that our brains naturally come up with in a perfectionist and protective way really impact how we feel. And then those feelings inform how we act and the energy with which we act.
Yeah. I mean, you shared a few things there that I think I would love to dive into a little bit more. One of the things you talked about is this energy piece. Is there a way to battle that energy or to correct that energy? I know sometimes I would just feel like I was in a failure loop, you know, like everything I tried was not going well or was not hitting the numbers I wanted it to hit. And I wonder if that was a certain energy I was having and if there was a way for me to correct that.
Yeah, I mean, so in the framework that I use, so I got certified through an organization called IPEC, and they have this framework called the Energy Leadership Index. And it talks about these two forms of energy that we all experience on a spectrum: catabolic energy and anabolic energy. So catabolic energy is a really depleting energy. We experience it when we're in a lot of judgment, black and white thinking. There's a lot of resistance there and dread. We wake up and we're like, oh, like it's Monday, or oh, it's January 1st, and that we're experiencing a lot of catabolic energy. Anabolic energy is more of a flow state energy. It's where we see a prism of opportunities, win-win, collaboration, connection, joy, helping. Like all of those things are more anabolic. And there's a spectrum from 1 to 7, 1 being the most catabolic and 7 being the most anabolic. And we're a combination of those energies at all different moments. And I think about like the old boom boxes with the flickering lights up and down, that's just how our energy is always moving. And it's not actually that one is bad and one is good. And everyone who's listening to this is probably like, well, I don't know, like that dread piece sounded pretty bad.
That black and white piece, I don't know about that.
But the truth is that actually the whole spectrum is like necessary in the human experience. Like when we are in, protection mode, catabolic energy, that dread, that avoidance, sometimes honestly, our nervous system is a little bit too vulnerable, and we need to be there. We need to protect ourselves for a moment. We need to heal. We need to go inside. And so it's not about judging ourselves like, oh, I'm experiencing this catabolic energy now and that's bad. It's about using it as a curiosity to say, okay, I'm feeling a lot of resistance here. What does that mean? What's behind it? And how do I want to show up for this moment, right? And what do I want my experience to feel like? And then there are tools and ways that we can choose to shift our energy when we want to. Like sometimes I will have something happen. I'll be like, ooh, like I feel it. Like there's that level 1,
there.
like there's that victimhood. And maybe I need to have a little pity party for myself really quick. But then I'm about to go into a meeting where I really want to be in my level 5, which is like win-win, mutual benefit. And I'm like, okay, what would it look like? What would it take for me to start to feel more anabolic energy right now? And then you can play with different tools. And even just that choice, even just that awareness that like we are not at the effect of our life and that we have choice around how we show up and the energy we bring to certain situations, that alone starts to create more anabolic energy because we don't feel so trapped in the circumstances that are happening to us.
Yeah, I love that. And I think the things that you just shared are so practical for fundraisers. I know for me, I always felt like I was running to the next thing. I didn't have time for thinking anything, but just to take that one beat and say, okay, I'm feeling the thing right now, and I'm going to acknowledge that, and then I'm going to move on. I think that's really practical and helpful. That's great. Another thing you talked about, and that I also very much so struggle with, is you mentioned perfectionism. I think as a fundraiser, it's very hard, honestly, in any case, but especially as a fundraiser, it's very hard to be perfect. There's no way to control other people's actions or giving or the fact that they will or will not show up for your event. Not that this is personal to me in any way, but what would you say to someone who is, really struggling with perfectionism in the nonprofit space?
Yeah. So, I mean, perfectionism is really, first of all, perfectionism is an illusion. Like perfect is an illusion. There's no such thing. Like when we think something is perfect, it's because we cannot see the imperfection. Like we don't understand what's behind the curtain, right? That's why it's so easy for us to observe other people and be like, oh, she does that perfectly, right? Because we're not looking for anything else. We're experiencing something in that moment. But with ourselves, we know what it took to bake that cookie. And we know we put in just a little bit too much salt, right? And so perfection is a total illusion. And honestly, what it really is a form of protection. Like our striving for perfection is really to protect ourselves from criticism, self-doubt, negative self-talk, like all of those things. And so one of the key strategies around dealing with perfectionism is, first of all, to start to acknowledge that it's an illusion, it's not a real thing, and to have our own back when we are imperfect. And to really, because one of the things that happens is when we make a mistake and then we beat ourselves up about that and we spiral in our head for a day or two, then the next time we have to make a decision, we're obsessing about how to make the perfect decision more than anything because we know how we treat ourselves when we make a mistake. And if we start to show up for ourselves with more grace and compassion and understanding, and, some of the sentences I use with myself is like, you made the best decision with the information you had in that moment, and more information now. Okay, well, that stinks that you didn't know it then, but you didn't know it then, And so just like saying, you made the best decision you could in the moment, or what's something you can learn from this without having to go back and sort of relitigate in your mind why you didn't do the exact perfect thing. It's like, okay, well, what's the learning here? And recognizing, I remember one time when I was the managing director of this organization, there was a mistake that happened that cost the organization $1,000. And we were really small, and that $1,000 hurt at the time. It totally did. And acknowledging and validating how much we wished we hadn't lost it was real. But then I remember saying to the executive director, this in 5 years, when we're a $2 million organization, would be a $100,000 mistake. And so it's actually really good that we learned it right now.
Right.
Like $1,000, it hurts, but relatively, like this was a really important lesson for us to learn. And so I think the way we talk to ourselves when we are imperfect is so important in starting to address our perfectionist tendencies.
Yeah, that's really helpful and great advice. Do you think that perfectionism is what feeds those energy loops? Like, do you think that being able to address perfectionism in a healthy way feeds anabolic energy, and losing yourself in the depths of perfectionism feeds the catabolic energy?
Well, perfectionism just is catabolic energy because it is black and white thinking. It is tunnel vision. It's completely like right or wrong, right? In perfectionism, there is no curiosity. There are a million right ways to do this. There's one right way, and it's the perfect way, or you have failed. So it's kind of the epitome of catabolic energy. And so when we start to, acknowledge and validate how we feel, show compassion for ourselves, and then get curious, all of those things are tools that start to bring us into more anabolic energy. So, people will always even asking me questions about the podcast. How do you do the podcast? How do you get this thing to be perfect? And my answer is always, there are 4,000 ways to make a great podcast, right? And it's about figuring out what's the right way for you. And so, but when we're in that kind of like fear, I have to get this right, that right that we're talking about in those moments is one way. And we lose so much creativity and we lose so much opportunity when we're in that mode. And so, yeah, it really just is kind of the epitome of one of the ways catabolic energy materializes.
Yeah. Wow, that's so interesting. I'm gonna kind of put you on the spot here.
Okay.
I have a real scenario for
Okay.
you, and I want you to tell me how I could have avoided perfectionism and catabolic energy in this moment.
Okay, hit me.
Okay. I was very, very early in my fundraising, and we were sending out an invitation to an event. And I had sent it to everyone in my company to look at it and to approve it. Everybody's good about it. That's fine. Once we sent it out, I announced in a meeting, we're so excited. We sent out this invitation for this event. You can see the invitation. I put it at your table. Would love for you to take it home, put it on your fridge, think about it, and someone in the room who had reviewed the invitation raised his hand and said, Julia, this is the wrong date. And we had mailed 500 of these invitations. So my perfectionist self and my torpedo into catabolic energy sent me to every post office in my city to try and track down these invitations instead of taking a moment to address what had happened. So how would you have handled a huge failure situation without spiraling?
How long between when you sent those out to the mail and that announcement was it?
I dropped them in one of those, public mailboxes that was on the corner. The afternoon before at like 4:30 p.m.
Okay.
Announced it in the meeting at 10 a.m.
Okay.
So I was like, maybe it's still in the mailbox.
Could
I'm
you?
going to go find it. I did go to the mailbox, stood there until the mailman came. There was nothing in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Could not stop it. Tried, could not.
I mean, I think you actually sort of said, so the perfectionism, a lot of times, so there are a few ways I would think about this. One is how you address the actual mistake that happened, right? And sometimes a level of urgency in addressing that mistake can allow you to correct it. Like I don't think it's such a bad thing that you tried to go to the mailbox and see if it was there. It's like, okay, like, yeah, let's see if there's a way to intercept this, right? That's like an action to maybe save you some other work down the line of having to resend out invitations with another date. For me, where the perfectionism really comes in is how you were talking to yourself while that was happening. If what was happening in your head was, you're so stupid, Julia, you always mess things like this up. I'm just saying things I know I would say.
Definitely.
Okay.
It's like you were there, Mallory.
It's because these narratives are the same in all of our heads, right? You're so bad at things like this. Like, why are you so bad at details like that? How could you have missed this? You should have known better. So all of those things, that's us verbalizing to ourselves in our mind, we should have been perfect. Like, right, our expectation of ourselves was perfectionism, and we let ourselves down in being imperfect. So that's where I think the course correction happens, right? It's like, it doesn't mean we don't try to actually correct the actual mistake if we can. Sure, right? You're not going to let those invitations go out like that and never take another action and let everybody show up on the wrong date. Of course not. Like, we're going to correct mistakes, but it's about what is the energy, the narrative that we bring to that mistake. Do you write everybody a totally self-deprecating email, bashing yourself for making a mistake? Or do you just come out being like, look how human we are. Apparently we
did this.
Apparently we wanted to see you 2 weeks earlier.
Yeah. That's a great
but
point.
the reality, here's the actual date, and it gave us another excuse to tell you this story about Janet. Like, what a great opportunity to get into your mail again and doing something kind of fun. And sure, did it maybe cost you a little bit more because you had to do a double mailer, but it's more about like how you show up to that correction piece. I remember a few years ago, there was an email that went out from my email system where I always personalize my emails in my newsletter, and the first name personalization sort of way that you enter that in was misspelled. And so, it was missing some character. So everybody got an email that said, hi, first name. And my VA at the time like freaked out and was like, we have to send an oops email. Like we need to, really kind of put our tail between our legs and send an email out to everyone like immediately, apologizing and all of this stuff. And I took a beat. And I felt in my body the like fear and urgency to make it right. I felt the perfectionism like want to come up, the like, how could you let this happen? All of these things. But I took a step back and I said, okay, what's a way that this could feel good? Like that oops email is not going to feel good to me. And it's probably not going to feel that great to anybody receiving it, right? But like, what's a way that I can really stand in my authenticity, be a human, not let the embarrassment of the moment or the shame I might be feeling drive my next behavior? Like, what does it look like to really do this in a way that feels good? And, part of that was also addressing in my head, like, this stuff is so normal and mistakes happen. And I cannot expect myself to never have things like this happen in my business. And so I ended up writing this email about how I'm going to keep personalizing all of my emails, mistakes and all, and how it's so easy good in the nonprofit sector when something like that happens or there's some data issue or something like that, we avoid then using that automation or we avoid using that data because something went wrong that one time. And that the reality is everybody who's getting this email right now knows that I do not personally one-on-one email 5,000 people at 4 a.m. on Tuesday morning. Everybody knows that. The personalization is there because I like speaking to you personally. But does it mean that sometimes there aren't little tech glitches that go wrong? No, but this is what it looks like to keep going. And that email, more than any other email I've ever written in the last 3 years, had a flood of responses.
That's amazing.
And so I think that's the piece is like recognizing that perfectionism is a gut reaction. It's a protection strategy. It's a get small, disappear. Don't be open to any level of criticism or anything like that. And to take those moments to say like, yeah, I'm not perfect.
Right.
And I don't expect myself to be perfect, but what does it look like for me to correct mistakes then in a way that feels good?
Right. I feel it even just happening in this conversation. When you said an email, a tail between my legs, oops email. And then you said, I learned from this and we all make mistakes. Like the energy when those statements are said is so different just sitting here talking about it. So I can't imagine people receiving an email and feeling one way or the other. It's really interesting how quickly that changes.
Yeah.
Which is what you were saying before about taking a beat in the moment and saying, oh, I'm feeling a little icky. I'm going to take a moment and consciously move myself on the spectrum, which is really great.
And so for your invitation thing, it could be like, okay, let's go see if they're still in the mailbox because that would be awesome, And then if they're not, okay, we'll figure out another plan, another way to address this, but without the whole story, the whole narrative, the whole beating ourselves up for a week around it.
Yeah, and I think I think the mailbox was a good move on my part. I think the 4 post offices I went after, not quite necessary. Maybe that's where the line should have been drawn, is the mailbox. No, I appreciate that advice. And I learned a lot from that experience. And I don't know, I think fundraisers just want the perfectionism. But I do think sometimes we forget anyone on the receiving end of the things that we're putting out want us and our organization to succeed.
Yeah.
Like they're on our side.
Totally.
I think sometimes it feels like you're in it alone as a fundraiser and all the people giving to your organization are in it with you. You know, you're not alone, but it's hard to feel like you're the one putting the information out and so you have to make it perfect. Yeah. It's definitely a battle.
Totally.
Well, are there any pieces of advice that you could share for the sector as a whole when supporting fundraisers? You and I are both very empathetic to fundraisers specifically. We've both been in the shoes of a fundraiser and we know the pressure and the stress. But what about, an executive director or a board member or a donor? What would you say to people that are part of the nonprofit but not necessarily the fundraiser about helping the fundraiser to feel the freedom to have anabolic energy and to not seek perfectionism?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of that is in the response to something like the letter. It's like what happens in the room when that happens, how, and what's not just what are people saying, but what's the energy in the room? Just like what you said, you could feel the difference in my energy when I was saying those two sentences. We can feel people's energy and we can feel when our bosses get clenched, even if they have said nothing, right? And so I think as the board or the executive director or a people manager with any type of, and not just positional leadership, like just like your energy in the room, and this is why addressing your own perfectionism is so important, because if you are expecting perfection from yourself, you're going to expect it from the people around you. Like they're just, that's because it's catabolic energy, it's judgment, it's black and white thinking. You can't only hold it for yourself and then have anabolic energy for everybody else. So one of the ways to support fundraisers being an anabolic energy is to be an anabolic energy yourself. And when something like that happens, to get curious, to be compassionate. Okay, what's a creative way we could solve this? Okay, Julia, like things like this happen. Like I know this feels big right now, but let's think about how we can use this to build even deeper relationships with our donors. Like what could we do here? So I think one is like in the reaction to the imperfection is really important. I also think sharing your own imperfections is really important. I think the more leaders can be transparent about their own challenges, about their own setbacks, about their own worries, the more it creates space for other people to recognize that they're not alone. When I hated fundraising and was so afraid of fundraising, nobody else around me was acknowledging that they felt similarly to fundraising. Yeah. And, I remember somebody said recently, I spoke in person at an event, there were maybe 1,000 people in the room. And when I talked about how much I hated fundraising and how afraid it made me, you literally could feel people breathe out in the room and like feel this like shoulder down like energy, just people being like, oh my God, I'm not, instead of like I'm the only one, I'm holding so much. And so I think some of it is like acknowledging and validating everybody's experience. The other is sharing our own vulnerabilities that create space for people to know that these feelings are normal, that talking about money is a very vulnerable thing to do, particularly for women who for generations have been told it's inappropriate to talk about money, and now are 75% of a sector that is trying to move money, right? And so I think normalizing some of that stuff, and women also, biologically are programmed to create harmony and not disrupt, or like our desire to be people pleasers and make everything harmonious is biologically programmed into us. And so I think the more we can talk about the things that make us feel uncomfortable, the things that make us feel like we're not doing a good job, and we can talk about those things in community, the more it creates that anabolic energy and that space for the fundraiser to be creative, to try new things, to be innovative, and to know that they're not just being told, take risks, but then when they fail, they're being criticized for it or knocked down in a staff meeting for it. And sometimes for the executive director, that means having your staffs back in a board meeting. And so I know sometimes, there's like this trickle down lack of support that happens. And I think it's really important to recognize we lead in the way that we model, we lead in the way that we react, and we focus so much on what we're saying in that staff meeting and instead of all these other ways in which we actually communicate our values. I think I'll add one more thing around how I think the sector needs to think about supporting fundraisers is around healing time between activating activities. So there are always going to be things in fundraising that create catabolic energy. Dealing with rejection, getting ghosted, right? Getting an angry email from that one donor, those things very understandably and naturally dysregulate our nervous system. They send us into a stress response. And when we expect fundraisers to just take hits like that all day, every day, and then get right back up and go and make an ask and be ready to be in connection with a different donor. And we don't give them space or breaks or time to breathe or time to reflect. It is no surprise that we're seeing the burnout and the exodus from the sector that we're seeing, because burnout is just chronic stress. And so if we don't allow people and give people time to heal and process, which is not just about rest, which is about like actual healing, then people stay in that stress state, right? And they stay in perfectionism, they stay in protection mode, because when we feel vulnerable, if we just got ghosted, oh, you better believe that's when our perfectionism comes out, right? Because we're trying to protect ourselves from experiencing that again, which makes total sense biologically. We're like, I feel very tender here, so I've got to get this right because I can't handle another hit at this moment. And so I think the more we can actually create space in this sector for fundraisers to heal and process, the more we'll see them be able to access the type of energy that they need to move money into their organizations.
Yeah, those are all really helpful things, especially for people who want to champion a fundraiser. I think those are great pieces of advice. What about, and you shared a little bit of this when you were just speaking, but what are some things that maybe the fundraiser themselves could do? For example, you shared about this conference that you were at where everyone took a collective breath. Maybe we need to get together with other fundraisers. I know when I was in my role at fundraising, I wanted to meet with other development directors in my area to see what kind of things were they doing that worked or didn't work, or what were they learning, things like that. So that maybe that's one piece of advice, is to connect with other people in development. But are there any other piece of advice that you have for fundraisers to grow and have that space to learn new things and to not have the pressure like perfectionism?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I think being in community, there's a lot of science to support the way that we co-regulate. And so being and heal together, there's a lot of literature coming out these days about the fact that there is no real such thing as self-care, that it is community care. And I think there's a combination, right? But there are a lot of ways that, we've seen throughout the evolution of the human species that people heal in community together. So being in safe spaces like that, where you can talk about hard things and be supported and realize that you're not alone and isolated. I think also because so many fundraisers are really isolated. They're especially in small, even mid-sized nonprofits, they're the solo person doing the thing that they're doing. And so, I definitely think like finding community that feels good. And sometimes that's in person, sometimes that's virtual. And there are a lot of different ways and things that work for folks. That's one thing I think for fundraisers. The other thing is to give time for their own sort of personal introspection and reflection. I say a lot that it's a lot easier, whether we believe it or not, to hustle ourselves and grind, because when we are in that mode, we can avoid a lot of things.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I get that. That makes sense.
Right. And so sometimes we stay busy because we're nervous to look at some of the stuff we've been talking about, during this conversation. Like we feel like we can't handle it. We can't manage it. What will we find there? What will we see there when we look into ourselves? And sometimes that can be a book that you read that helps guide you through the process. For some people, it's a therapist or a coach, something that sort of invests in your ability to take that step back, and even just the time to take that step back. For me, before I, did all this work, for me, it was a yoga practice. It was like the one time where I felt like I was being quiet and stopping. And it took me going through speed power yoga to finally get there. Right. And so it's like finding your thing, but what lets you tap into yourself? What in your life makes you feel like you're really in your body, and giving yourself the space and the time to do that, and valuing that. I think that is really important, and boundaries are a part of that. Fundraisers, setting their own boundaries and knowing that, a lot of times our organizations are not going to do that for us.
Right.
And so we have to figure out and design our lives as best we can, and that does it mean less things, less items will get done? Yeah, it does. And you know what? That's actually okay, because the more time we spend in anabolic energy, we are so much more productive because we have the creativity and flexibility and all of these things to actually address the highest priority items instead of seeking out the dopamine hits of the check boxes.
Right.
And so it's like, you know, what is that saying? Like slow down to speed up or something. I think that is really, really true in nonprofit fundraising, and just not something that we give ourselves a lot of time for.
Yeah. Wow, that I feel so rejuvenated from this conversation. I'm about to take all of these things and put them into my life. I really appreciate the practicality that you're sharing and just the encouragement. I hope that those listening feel encouraged by this conversation, and that there are some really practical things that they can put into practice starting today. The taking a beat after you have something that makes you feel some type of way can start right now. We can start that today. So I really appreciate that. Any final thoughts or any last notes for those listening?
Yeah, I think just knowing that you can start small.
Yeah.
If all you take away from this is like acknowledging and validating your own feelings, using your emotions as like a space to get curious, and like actually getting curious, if you just did those three things, you would start to watch yourself experience more anabolic energy, and you would watch yourself have some more space to deal with the real challenges. You know, we cannot hustle ourselves into clarity.
Ooh. Somebody write that down. That's so good. That's so good.
And I think we've just been really taught to try.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is like recognizing how we talk to ourselves. Like, even if you just start to notice that, if you just start to notice what the relationship with yourself is like, it's such an important part of this journey. And to do it without judgment, you know, to just know, and hopefully they've heard from both you and I sharing that like the narratives they're hearing, the stories that they're hearing in their head, the doubts they're having are so normal.
Yeah.
And I had this experience once where I was talking to a fundraiser on the phone who's like actually a pretty like famous executive director, and she was talking about how much she, looked up to this other woman that I'm friends with who's also like a pretty famous nonprofit leader. And she was sort of reflecting like, oh, she has it so together. And the woman I was on the phone with was having a lot of self-doubt. And she was sort of like, I wish I could be more like so-and-so and da-da-da. No joke. I hang up this coaching call, and 3 minutes later, I get a phone call from the woman she was talking about spiraling.
Wow.
And you know, something had happened with her kid, and she was just like in a real place of like self-doubt and self-criticism. And so I think it was just this moment for me of like, everybody, this is like the most normal human experience. And so I think know that and be compassionate with yourself around it, and then recognize that you do have some options to change your relationship with yourself at any point. At any point in your life, you get to change your relationship with yourself, your relationship with money, with work. Whenever you want, you get to change your mind and change your operating systems. But it has to start with getting curious about what is and what isn't working for you.
That's great. I'm ready. Let's go. I feel like we can take on the world. Let's do that. Thank you so much, Mallory. This has been wonderful, and I feel incredibly encouraged, and I hope that those listening do too. It's great to have time with you. Thank you.
Always. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Nonprofit Expert, presented by Donor Perfect. For more information and a special offer, visit donorperfect.com/podcast.